As a teenager, I loved going into the woods. No parents to tell me what to do. No cops to witness my extracurricular activities. The problem is, the lack of oversight makes the woods attractive to anyone that wants a little privacy, whether their intentions are good or bad. Years ago, in the late 1990s, my brother and his high school buddies were hanging out in the hills behind our neighborhood at the edge of a national forest. They were drinking, smoking, and walking along a fire access road. They were throwing rocks over the edge when my brother hit something that left a loud thunk. The boys were naturally curious, so they climbed down the hillside at the most safe point and went down into the arroyo, looking for whatever it was that my brother's rock hit. The rock landed on top of an old wrecked car from the early 1950s or maybe late 1940s at the bottom of the arroyo. Inside the car was a family of skeletons and a picnic basket. The family had apparently veered off the fire road and crashed the car years ago. They hadn't been found until that day. My brother and his friends climbed out and made it back onto the fire access road. They headed down the road and placed an anonymous payphone call to report the wreck. This was before everyone had cell phones, of course. No one stuck around to see what would happen when the police arrived. They don't know what became of the wreck. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005. I was about 13 years old. A good ways outside the town of Uvlad, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres down outside of that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfortable, I hated it. All I had to do was to either stare out the window or try to beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. Anyway, the drive obviously took most of the day, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it yet that year, and the cabin on the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in Scouts for a couple years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable with roughing it. After unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough. Dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit, we decided we would try to get some sleep, so we got out the sleeping bags and set up the cots. Something about that night was weird. I was never able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was maybe an hour. When we woke up, it was so early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs, and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. Now again, this was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got the lease that nobody was there. Not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright colored red jacket. We slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters, and this is private land." The person didn't move at all. Dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. Weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in summer. It was about 98 degrees outside by then. My dad called out again, but there was no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip to his pistol holster. Sadly, it's all we had at the time. We were only scouting the area, so the rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down and watched him circle around to the front of the man, all while talking to him and asking him if he was okay. He finally passed around to the front of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there, staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, no sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than a day at most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him get worried. Almost immediately after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched. And I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We are leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back. The entire time, I was trying to hold back the panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity. But in reality, it was 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he never had an issue with people before because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the least possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling, but didn't want to wake me up, because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week he got a call from his buddy, and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone. No mannequin, no nothing. It still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap, or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but definitely top 3.
Oh man, those were 2 of the greatest stories. And now I'm gonna share with you guys 2 of this week's greatest comments in this week's Top Commenter. This week's top commenter is Katie Morris, and her comments read, "You got it. Great graphics, great narration. I subscribed in a second. Keep up the great work you do." And her second comment was, "I've watched a lot of these, and it's about graphics and narration for me, and you have the best to date. I'm a die-hard fan now. Keep it coming. I have just about caught up on your episodes and won't stop till I do." So, I want you guys to pay special attention where she says, "best to date?" I think this horror babe just asked me out. So, for becoming my new girlfriend, I'm naming horror babe Katie Morris this week's top commenter. And now, back to the mannequin story. 3 days later, there was a series of muggings in the area. Everyone reported the mugger was a mannequin. The police asked the third victim if the mannequin was just a torso. The victim thought about it for a moment and said, "No, he was armed and dangerous." Get it?